Hi, this is Robin, and this is the third in my series on adjusting tonal values in Photoshop. I've been demonstrating different approaches that you can use to add depth, dimension, and more of a wow factor to your images in Photoshop. And you might ask, well, why should we even know how to make tonal adjustments? What's the value of that? And the answer is that sometimes when we're out shooting, the ambient light just isn't good, or we've used the wrong exposure settings in our cameras, and it just caused our images to come out looking really flat as opposed to having a lot of dimension and depth to them. And there's no need to throw out or discard those more flat looking images because we can pull them into Photoshop and salvage them by enhancing or adding some more darks and lights. So in other words, the shadows, midtones, and highlights to the images to give them the depth that the camera didn't capture. And that's what I mean by talking about adjusting tonal values. So I've already done two videos that are also posted on my YouTube channel. In the first video, we talked about one method for doing tonal value adjustments based on apply image, and that can be found under the image menu in Photoshop. So if you want to see how to use that facility in Photoshop, you can check out that video. The second video focused on using the black and white adjustment layer plus a blend mode to do tonal value adjustments. And in this video, I'm going to focus on sculpting light by using curves, levels, and dodge and burn, plus selections. So we can get started, and I'm going to use a different image than I've used in my previous two videos. So this is the image of mine that we're going to use. And I'm calling it the Prospector, and this is a guy who was just out with a metal detector in one of the local parks nearby, and I thought it would make a good subject for a photo. But to me, this photo came out really kind of washed out and kind of flat. So I'm going to be using this as an example today to show you these three different methods that I talked about: curves, levels, and dodge and burn, in order to add some more dimension to this image. So in curves, if you're not familiar with it, it lets you make tonal adjustments throughout an entire tonal range. So that means all the way from the deepest black to the pure white and all of the shades of gray that are in between those two ends of the spectrum. And that you can make with curves a lot finer or more micro adjustments than you can using levels. You have a lot more control using curves than levels, so I definitely prefer it as one of the methods I want to use when I'm making tonal adjustments, and typically will not work with levels for that type of an adjustment. And so let's go through this demo here, and I'll show you a few examples of how to work with curves to add some tonal value adjustments. So the first thing I always do is I duplicate my background layer so I can have a duplicate image to work on. I don't want to do anything to damage the original. Now, as I said, we're going to be working with sculpting, as I called it, sculpting these images with lights and tones. And so what I mean by that is we're picking out selective areas of the image that we're going to be doing some darkening and lightening to. So to get started, I use the lasso tool, which is up near the top of the toolbar, at least on the way I have mine laid out. It's this little icon right here. And what I do is I look in the image to say, okay, where were some of the shadows? Where were the midtones? And where were the highlights in the image? And how can I just further enhance them rather than to create something completely out of nothing? So if I look at this bush here in the foreground, you can see that sort of this lower 2/3 of it is in some shadow. So I'm going to take my lasso tool and I'm going to start to sort of loosely, don't worry about being too specific about it, tracing around the area where I see some shadow in the image. So when I start that lasso line, you have to always be sure you close the connection at the end so that you get the marching ants. Then I'm going to come over, because I said we're going to be working with curves, to the bottom of the layers panel, go to the adjustment layer icon, which is the circle with the line through it, and click on that, and then come down to where it says curves and just click on that, and that adds a curves adjustment layer. So the next thing I'm going to do is I have my targeted adjustment tool active, so that's this little hand icon with the pointing finger, and I'm going to click into this area that I just selected. And what that's going to do is it's going to put a dot on my curves line here that will show me where that value is in the range from darkest black to brightest white. And we're working on black to white in both of the x-axis, so this horizontal axis, which is the input axis, and on the y-axis, which is the vertical axis or the output axis. Once I get that little dot there, I'm going to just pull down if I want to darken the shadows, because I said we're working with a shadow. So it's pulling down. You see, we're pulling down towards the darker area from the lighter area when you look at your axis. And you can see by doing that, we've darkened up this area in here, but that's just a really specific line, and it doesn't blend very well with the image. So what we need to do is come back and click on the icon for curves on that layer, active layer. Be sure the white frame is around the icon to show that it's active. And then we're going to click back over here to make sure we're in the right place. Okay, so we're on the mask. And now come down to where it says feather, and we're going to pull that towards the right to soften how that darkening looks. See how it's getting softer the more we pull it to the right? And let me just show you what's happening on the mask so you can see why we're doing this. So if I open the mask for that layer, first of all, you'll see we just selected this one area of the image. So we're controlling exactly where the tonal adjustments are going by doing this versus having it applied to the entire image. So where it's white on the mask is where the effect will be applied. And you can see what a really sharp, harsh line this is. But if we come over to feather and pull that little arrowhead to the right and watch on the mask, see, you can see how it's feathering out, it's softening the transition between the area that you're working on and the rest of the image. So I'll go back to it where we can see the image. And let's just do that a little more. Okay, so yeah, so we've added a very definite new shadow capability there. I think we can soften it a little bit more, and maybe even dial, if you think it's too much, you can dial back your opacity a little bit too. There. Okay, so now let's make another selection and maybe choose another area to do some shadow adjustments on. We've got our lasso tool active. We're going to make a loose drawing around the area where we want to make a shadow enhancement. Make sure you connect the ends so you get the marching ants. Come over to your adjustment layer icon, click on that, come down to curves, and again we've gotten the area that we selected, so the white area is what we're going to be working with. And I really like doing this this way, so as I said, I can sculpt or carve out areas versus doing this over the entire image and then having to paint things out. I just think it's easier to do it this way for me, and I can control where I want it to go. So again, we're going to use our clicking on this icon. We're going to use our little targeted adjustment tool with the pointing finger there. Click into this area, and let's put a value where that value is on our curves line. And again, we want shadows, so I'm going to pull down to get it darker. So we go from lighter to darker. I'm pulling this dot straight down in the direction of getting darker. And then we're going to come back to the mask, and we're going to feather this mask so that we don't have that harsh line. There we go, and let's see how we're doing here. Yeah, so we've gotten more shadow values in there, and again you can do the same thing, and if that's more than you feel comfortable with, just lower the opacity to taste. It's not something I can give you a value for. Okay, so we've done two curves layers working with shadows, and so now let's take our lasso tool and see if we can find an area that maybe we want to add some highlights. So since we want to draw attention to our prospector, let's maybe draw over in this area here and create sort of a visual line to bring attention to him. Okay, and we'll come back to our adjustment layer icon, click on curves, and we've got that little area selected there. We're going to come back to our targeted adjustment tool and click into this area, and we've got our line right there because that's the value represented by this area in here, and this is exactly why I like curves over levels, because levels you're just working with macro areas of shadows, midtones, and highlights. Here you can get down to specific tonal values. So as I said, I wanted to add some highlights here to kind of use it as a visual arrow to point towards the man. So again, if we look at our axis here, we'll see that to get lighter and add highlights, we have to go up. So we click on that little dot and we start going up and down. If you've gone too far and you want to come down in just very gradual sorts of way, you can click on the down arrow on your keyboard and it'll take you down in very micro steps with that dot. So let's see how we look here. Yeah, so I've gotten some more highlights there. So let me click back on the mask and do the same kind of feathering that we've done on the other layers. So keep it subtle. There we go. There we go. Okay, so I think, that's enough to show you the process for working with curves, and at least using my method, which is sculpting or carving out a specific area that you want to be adjusting the highlights and the midtones and the shadows for. So now what I'm going to do is click on this top layer, press my Shift key, click on that layer, and then click on this little file folder icon, and I'm going to create a group called curves, just so we can see what we've accomplished with the curves adjustments. The next method that I was going to show you, and that I had mentioned at the beginning, is one of the three methods we were going to look at today, is working with levels. And it's a similar process, but what you'll see when you get to the tool and the properties of the tool will be quite different. So levels will also let you adjust and correct tonal range or intensity, but again, as I said, it works with shadows, midtones, and highlights in a more macro, less specific way than curves. So what we're going to do here is, again, use our lasso tool, and let's carve out another area that we want to darken. So I'm going to pick this area in here, and again, just draw loosely, don't get too specific about it, because depending on the image that you're working on, you can be more or less specific. Come back over to our adjustment layer icon, go down to where it says levels and click on that, and it looks pretty much the same. You'll get a mask with the selected area on it and an icon and the properties down at the bottom. But look at how different the properties at the bottom look in levels than in curves. You don't have that line, that curves line going up through, and you don't have the two different axes with all of the different control over all the tonal values from dark to light. Here we have an area for the pure blacks on the far left, the pure whites on the far right, and the midtones in the center. So you can pull these little arrowheads in the direction that you want to adjust them to taste. So if I want to, for instance, darken the pure blacks in that area, I'd pull this, and you can see in here, if you watch in here, that there is some adjustment being made to make some of the blacks darker. If I pull from the left in, I'm going to be making some of the whites brighter, but since we were adjusting shadows, I'm going to stay away from the highlights. And then if we go to the midtones, let's see, okay, pulling to the left makes it lighter, and pulling to the right is going to make it darker, so we can get some more tonal adjustment value in there. And again, what I'm trying to do is visually get all of your eye and your attention to circle around here by having areas that will recede by being dark and areas that'll come more forward by being light. So I think I'm going to stay with that right where I've adjusted that there. We're going to come back to our mask just like we did with curves, come down to feather, and just gradually soften up that mask so it's a more subtle adjustment. I tend to go past it and then back down to it, but you can experiment to see what you want to do. So there's an example with some more shadows added into that area. Let's try another one with starting with the lasso and drawing in some darker area and some more shadow values into this area here. Okay, come back to the adjustment layer icon, come down to levels. We've got our mask with the area selected that we're going to be working on. We're going to come down to our histogram, and it looks like we've already got some values that are already out in the blacks, but we can see if it does anything. So that makes it a little darker. Since I'm working with the shadows, I'm not going to do anything with the white sliders, but I am going to work with the midtones slider and make that a little darker there. So we can see what we've got with that. Okay, come to the mask, click on the mask so that there's a white frame around it, come down to feather, and soften up that line. Okay, and then now let's just try one area like we did with curves where we're going to be choosing some highlights we can work with. So let me, using the lasso tool, come in and again sort of draw another little visual arrow towards our prospector by selecting the area that was more in the highlights on this bush. Open a new levels layer. See, we have our selection, and in this one, as I said, we want to brighten up the highlights. So in this one, I'm going to leave the shadows or the darkest blacks areas alone, and I'm going to pull from the right to the left to add some more lightness to this area for highlight. And we can pull the midtones either a little to the left if you want it more bright, or a little to the right if you want to temper the amount. And I might even do a little bit of opacity lowering on that. And then we'll come back to our mask, come down to feather, and soften up the line that we just drew. Okay, so that was adding some shadows and a layer of highlights using levels. So again, I'm going to group these into a levels group so we can see what we accomplish at each stage here. And then the final method that I said I was going to show you was something called dodge and burn. And dodge and burn is something that comes from the darkroom days of photography. Dodge means to lighten and burn means to brighten. And I definitely suggest you don't ever dodge and burn directly on an image. It could be destructive to the image and you might not be able to recover from it. So always use a duplicate layer or work on some other layer than the layer that the image is on. So what I'm going to suggest you do here, let me put this cursor down there, is use your Alt or Option key if you're on a Mac. Alt for PC, Option for a Mac, and keep the Alt key pressed down. And then click on the new layer icon, which is over here in your layers panel with the little plus sign. and you'll pop up this new layer pop-up box. And what we want to do on here is to choose a mode to work with. And I'm going to call this layer Burn, just so we know what we're doing here. So this is the darkening layer. And we're going to come down and pick a mode to work with. And I recommend that you work with either overlay or soft light. Typically in Photoshop, the overlay blending mode is a harsher kind of an effect, and soft light is a little bit softer. I personally prefer soft light, but you can experiment. A lot of people do prefer to use overlay, so just try those two and see which one you like the look of better. Once you get your blending mode set, then you want to click on this little box right here that says Fill with Soft Light Neutral Color 50% Gray, and then click OK. And what you have done now is added a layer that you can work on to do your burning in the image. I'm going to grab this layer, drag it down to the new layer icon there to make a duplicate of it. And I'm going to change the name on the second version of that layer to call it Dodge. So that will be our lightening. So this is our darkening or our shadows. This is our lightening or our highlights. And I'm going to start on the burn layer. And you can see we've got it set so our soft light blend mode is on there. Now when I paint, I'm going to paint on this with a brush. So we're going to use our brush tool. Let's click on that to activate that. We'll come over and make sure in the options bar that you're using a soft brush, so I've got that active. And I'd say to lower your opacity. I had been working with this before, so I already have it set here. Don't use your opacity and flow at 100%. It'll be too much and it'll be too dark. You can experiment where you like it the best for you, but I tend, and at least for this image, to like it around 40 to 45% opacity, and to have the flow around 20 to 25%. And I keep my smoothing at 0 just so there is less lag in what I'm doing. So in order to burn, we're going to paint with black. So we've got our brush set and we've got our brush settings. Now we have to choose our paint to use on that active burn layer, and we're going to use black. So be sure that black is your foreground color. And we're going to start painting on here to see where we can add some more shadows. So where my highlight is where I am painting with my brush. And I'm just going to add some more darkness in these areas where I'm painting. And I'm just going to, again, work pretty quickly because this doesn't need to be perfect. The point is just to show you the method to use. And so again, you can enlarge your brush or shrink your brush to suit what you're painting on in your image. But I'm just darkening up wherever it is that you're seeing the cursor. I'm painting to darken those areas. I'm going to darken this wall back here. And I'm going to darken this wall in here. And I'm going to follow where I see some slight shadow that's already in my image that just needs to be enhanced and brought out more. So again, just working very roughly, and you can take more time on your image to figure out. But so again, this is just strictly painting now at this point. We're not lassoing, we're just showing where it's going to be darker and where it's going to be lighter. And then I'm going to make my prospector a little bigger and make my brush a little smaller. You can see the white circle in the center there is where the brush is. And where he has some shadow on his sweater, I'm just darkening it up a little bit. Going to put some more shadows on the back of his legs and darken his shoes. Okay. And let's see, if we want to lower the opacity with that a little bit, we can make it a little more subtle. So let's turn that layer on and off so you can see where we're sculpting or adding some more depth and dimension to this image just by burning and painting on the image, on a copy of the image. So now we're going to move on to the dodge layer, or the lightening and brightening layer, that's going to be working on the highlights. And I'll approach it the same way that I did here for burn, which is using a brush tool with a soft brush, lowered opacity and flow, smoothing turned off. And this time, since we want to work on the highlights and lighten and brighten selective parts of the image, you have to make sure that your foreground paint color is on white, and we'll be painting on this active gray, 50% gray level layer here. So just to start, let me blow this up so I can see my prospector a little bit, and maybe I'll make my brush a little smaller. And what I'm going to try to do is follow along, and I recommend you do this on your images too, is where you see highlights already, just try to paint in those places and just enhance it a little more. He's got some more highlights on his hoodie, so I'll do something like that. We want to make sure that his scanning device stands out. Okay, and then I'll go back out, zoomed out view again, and then I'll just start painting along. Maybe I'll do a little bit bigger brush since we're not on him. We can move a little faster here. On some of these other bushes that look like they had some highlights on them that need to be brought out a little bit more. And I probably won't want to put highlights close to the edges because brights grab your attention and grab your eye, and so we want to keep people centered into the image. So we'll keep the lights towards the center. And we already had worked on this, but I'll give it a little bit more zhuzh, as they say. Here's some more highlights on top of this bush. Let's see what we've done here. Yeah, so you can see we've added some more highlights to this image. Okay, and we can lower the opacity on that a little bit too if it's too dramatic. There we go. And opacity just a little bit more. I think I can come down even a little bit more on that, so let me bring highlights down so it's not quite so obvious. And let's see what we've accomplished here from the original to using levels, curves, and dodge and burn. And you can see it's added a lot more dimension to the image. If I turn off the different eyes, you can see that there's curves, there's with levels, and then there's with the dodge and burn added as well. So I think the main takeaway from this is not only that you can make tonal adjustments to improve images that may be flat to start with, but there are multiple ways to skin a cat in Photoshop, and so you have multiple tools at your disposal to try to experiment with and see what gives you the best results, from curves to levels to dodge and burn. If you want to try to create more sculpted tonal variations in your image. So hope there's been some information you can use here. Thanks again.